getting started on scrolling tongs here. So these ones, these are pretty similar, a few little details different as what Mark Asprey has in his book. So if you've gone through that, you've seen similar to what I'm doing today. They're similar to a standard kind of a quarter turn tongs, except for that they're made out of flat bar. You can use 3/8 or 1/2 inch by 1 inch. 3/8 is obviously a little easier. And the 24 inches is just so you can handle it easier, especially with the gas forge. You don't need to use the whole length of that. And then you can choose to do forged or welded reins. But if you just do forged reins for this level, that's fine. So to get started, it's funny going through these steps. I realize that they're pretty similar to that scrolling fork. So we do the same thing. We have to set off the first tong tip. So we mark our anvil again because it's easier to see a mark on our anvil than it is to see a mark on our red hot steel. So we mark our anvil at 7/8. This is one of the differences I had with Mark's design. I accidentally did 7/8 and my jaw came out something that I liked. And then I reread the book and it said, I think 1.25 inches. And you know, as you forge out, that thing is going to grow. So you're going to get substantially longer. If it was a perfect cone, then you would end up with 3 times longer. But since these ones are kind of bulged in the middle, we don't end up with 3 times the length. So, but I started with 7/8 and that was fine. And then first thing we need to do is set that first boss. And again, it works better to drop your tong material down to get that first initial step. That way you can feel it as you're pushing into the anvil. You have a solid stop to keep that thing as sharp as you can. And then we're going to set that down to about 7/16 square. So it can grow as we forge along, and that's fine. And then just keep your width in check to keep everything tidy as you go. So here's that first heat. So every once in a while it bounces forward because I'm keeping so much forward pressure on that so that it doesn't slide back and I'll have 2 notches there. And you can also see if you use heavy enough blows, then you don't end up with fish lips at the tips. You can see compared to the thickness of the stock, my blow is heavy enough that I didn't end up with any fish lips. So the middle of my stock moved just as far. Okay, then after that, we're just going to start our taper of our tip. We're going to do that on 3 sides. We want the center of the jaw to stay straight so that we can have parallel jaws when we're done. So we're just going to taper 3 sides. I had troubles with my anvil block because it was moving around so much because it's actually made for a different anvil. So it was helpful for me to just do this on the horn, and I'm just protecting that boss so that I don't mess that up. So then just as we do any other taper, we're going to go from square to octagon to round. We can finish the tip out at 1/16 to 1/8 of an inch, whatever you want to do. If you're doing leaf work, you might want to do a little smaller for getting down inside of the stems. If you're twisting stems of a leaf up. I sort of filed out this taper. You can see on the next picture here. When I was forging it, I left that taper change so you could see the square body and then the transition, but you could file that away or forge it away or whatever. So after we're done with our first jaw, then same as any quarter turn tongs, we're going to turn our bar away from our hammer hand. So if you're making these for hand forging, that would just be in your regular tong hand is where you're holding them. So you'll turn that away from your hammer hand, which is to the left if you're making left-handed tongs. And then you're also going to push your hand away in order to give clearance right here for the boss. And you can do anywhere between 30 and 45 degrees. You'll be able to look in another slide and see what that does. And then we're kind of shooting to bisect this radius edge right here. So where that transition happens, this is the start of the boss, and this is the start of the jaw. So we want to bisect that line. I could have maybe slid it back towards me a little bit, and we're going to do that with half face blows. So here you can see that that half face blow, that line bisects that, and that's where that growth and width of our jaw can clear the other boss. So that's what we're doing, and you can see this is right here where that is as well. So here's just trying to keep that as flat as we can without over forging that below the thickness of the parent stalk. So it's not much to that step, but we end up with just that small transition here. So that's where these flat bar tongs are a little bit easier than the other one. So then after that, we're going to move on to the next boss, or to the other side of the boss. We're going to start marking at 7/8 of an inch. And if you remember last time, whenever we're doing these sort of half face blows, we end up with our stock moving. So we want to end up with a 1-inch boss at the end. And by starting at 7/8, we'll end up sliding that 1/8 of an inch. So we'll have our 1/8 inch at the end. And then on this one, since we can't use the edge of our anvil, or we can't mark the face of our anvil, we can just make a mark cold on our metal. That way, when we come out, we can feel that indentation and index to that for where we do start that boss. So first thing we're going to do is we're going to set that right on that mark, and then we're going to leave it held up at an angle so we are parallel to that forward edge. So these end up being like maybe 30 degrees or something. These boss, some people leave these corners rounded, other people do like a square corner there. So that's up to you. Make sure you're addressing your swelling and thickness. We always want to make sure we end up leaving just a little bit more than half of the material. So we want to have about 9/16 material left at the root of our jaws, because that's where the highest bending force is on the tongs. So I keep that up, and you can see my anvil, side of my anvil is pretty much parallel with that forward side of the boss. And then protecting that jaw. And then you can go ahead and start isolating some of that, get some of that material out of the way. The biggest problem I always have with tongs is I end up probably going too far here, because I just want to keep tidying up later, and then you end up with half the thickness, and they just aren't as strong right there at the start. So the next thing we can do is we can start compacting that boss together. This is like a square corner right here. We're just kind of upsetting that corner and tidying up all these edges. Ideally, we'll have both of these faces parallel, and these other two faces parallel. And that's where we want to have that 9/16. So we're just over half the thickness of our material. You can always take that down later if you leave a little more, but it's kind of hard to get that back after you've overforged that over the corner, which I've done several times. So that's why I thought I would point that out. And then after you're done with that, then you're just into, bulk forging, trying to knock those reins down. Or if you are inclined, you can also do a welded reins. But again, that is a good skill, and it's used on the basket. poker, so it's in the realm of this level, but you can choose to do either one. Some people like to leave their reins round for comfort. Other people, if you pound your round rein slightly flat and make it into an oval, it just gets a little bit stronger. So if you want to do that, I usually round mine about half of the length, rounded up to around 3/8 of an inch on the end. So it kind of tapers the whole length. And then for this size, 5/16 is probably a good rivet size. So for a 3/8 stock. And we're going to try to pick whatever tong is the smallest, has the least amount of real estate. And if we do that, then we can center this hole a little bit on our first one, and we have more room to do it on the second one. We need to, if we hot rasp all of this right now before we get this together, then it's going to be a lot easier to do that when they're separated. So you can see these are hot rasped already. And then I just marked an X here at the center of my 1 inch, and these were both about the same size. You can drill your hole if you want, or punch it, either one. And then this is also something that's helpful because of the order of operations with punching and back punching. If you center punch your hole on your flat side, then that means when you back punch, you'll be doing that over a pritchel hole, and you won't be flattening your boss or your jaw step. So you'll have the flat side up when you get started. Here I'm getting this started, punching it out, and I'm hanging my jaw over the edge of my anvil here. And same thing with over here. And then that way, now that I've flipped this to back punch it, then my jaw is up on top. So when I'm trying to get into my pritchel. Otherwise, if you hung that over, you wouldn't be able to punch all the way through. You can do that over your pritchel hole. If you have a really big pritchel hole, it might be helpful to use a bolster that has a hole closer to your rivet. So that way you don't get so much material caving down into your pritchel hole. And then you want to make sure that this face where they're going to mate is flat. So use your hammer to flatten that out. You can even hit it with the hot rasp a little bit to make sure that because that's the two faces that are going to be in contact with each other. So make sure that that is nice and smooth so your tongs have a good action when they're completed. And of course, now we get to have math. Every blacksmith lesson, I think, maybe needs to have some math somewhere in it. So the general formula for formed rivet heads is a 1.5 to 2D times the diameter of the stock. So 2D ends up getting to be a little bit unwieldy to handle. As soon as you get more than 2 or 3 widths high, you start getting unstable. And so you can kind of see that even in this looks a little bit tall. So we're going to do 1.5D on the shorter side. So that way it's easier to rivet. And then the thickness of our stock is just 3/8 plus 3/8. And then we have 1.5D again. So we end up with 3 diameters total and 3/4 of an inch with our stock. So that's about 3/4 and 15/16, which I just moved to 1 3/4. And that pushes me a little bit closer to the 2D. So, and then you can use whatever you want as a spacer underneath. A lot of people use a nut because there's several different sizes you can choose from. And whatever size you use needs to match the calculation that you used on your stock. So if you're making a 2D rivet on each end, then you need to make sure that your spacer is 2D thick. So we're doing 1.5D, which is about 7/16. I think this is maybe a 1/2 inch nut is what ended up being about that thick. Moving forward, you guys get to cut your rivet at 1 3/4, but that's how we came up with that. So we're going to go ahead and set our rivet First one we're going to set is with that nut underneath. And we're going to start with a heavy blow. The heavier the blow is, the more it will affect the entire thickness of the stock. The lighter blows, it'll affect more of just the surface. So at the beginning of riveting, we're trying to make sure our rivet is filling that hole so that our diameter that was drifted a little bit over 5/16, we want our rivet to snug up in the diameter of that. So we want to hit it hard enough that it swells up all the way around. Then as we start changing, just riveting just the head, then we'll end up with lighter blows. So now you can see I'm kind of chasing this rivet around because it's still trying to go over in every direction. So I'm basically just moving to the side so that I can push that rivet over. And now I'm doing lighter blows just to rivet that head. So there you can see we got the one side. I'll come back and rivet this head on another heat now. Then we're going to do the second rivet head. And this one, you'll see at first I start with my flat face of my hammer, and then midstream I'll spin my hammer. I like to use a rounding hammer to rivet, and I will work my rounding hammer all the way around, and by holding it vertical, I'm using a different angle on a different portion of my rounding hammer, so it ends up crowning the rivet head all the way around without me moving my body into a whole bunch of awkward positions as I go around. So I think that's kind of a way you can adapt your tool positions to help save a little force on your body. So now I'm just kind of doing light blows to form the head of that rivet. And my hammer pretty much stays vertical, and I move around that for clearance all the way around. We end up with a crowned rivet there. Next thing we need to do is we can take a heat, pretty warm heat, and align our jaws with the spacer. So we want about 1/8 of an inch clearance. You may want different sizes of these depending on how heavy stock you're going to be using and where you're working your scrolls. So these are lighter weight with the 3/8 of an inch. So the thinner diameter is where we probably are going to be working. So we're trying to make these two faces parallel, and you can just tap those down into the anvil and make sure you're holding your fingers between your tongs so that you can have some hand clearance when you're done. So here's just tapping those jaws parallel. And then work both tips down right into that stock. So next thing you need to do is take another heat and straighten up your handles. You can, if you're making a left-handed or a right-handed, leave your jaws offset. Because of the ways our hands and our fingers are, it's nice to have those on different sides. If you're going to make them ambidextrous, some tongs you may want to use in a power hammer or at your anvil. So a lot of people use their right hand for their tongs when they're at a power hammer. So some people will have both, either right-handed or left-handed, or they will just make the tongs with the two reins vertical. So they work for both, but these ones are a left-handed pair of tongs. So if we're going to be hand forging. And then just some final tips. When we're cooling those, if it's mild steel, then we can put them in water and work them back and forth. If it's a stronger steel, then we probably don't want to put those in water and want them to gradually cool down. And so we can just work them by hand back and forth to do that. And I like the mild steel tongs maybe a little bit more than some of the other exotic metals because I can quench them if they get hot from whatever I'm doing. Otherwise, you just need to basically set them down and wait for them to cool. So I've converted a few hoof nippers to tongs, and I've cracked the jaws because I got careless and quenched them, and then the next hit, the jaw breaks off. So and then just that one reminder to make sure you always leave more than half whenever you are setting that second side of the boss down, so that way you have that nice strong root and then it tapers out to 3/4. So there you have your scrolling wrench and your tongs.